discussions around how we should build AI that don't account for what we're trying to build are essentially pointless, right? There is no right way to build AI. An anomaly arises because what we have is we're still in the mindset where like, okay, the goal is to build to like recreate a human. Right? But suddenly we're like in the natural world. And then it's like, okay, so we want to recreate a human in the natural world, right? And then this suddenly starts to be a bit weird. People in machine learning and AI research, particularly people who've entered the field more recently, say things like, it's not clear what we have ever learned from the brain, right, from the study of the brain. So this is, kind of in my view, this is
Brain Inspired.
Good day to you. I am Paul. My guest today is Christopher Summerfield. Chris runs the Human Information Processing Lab at University of Oxford, and he's also a research scientist at Deepmind. You may remember him from episode 95 with Sam Gershman when we discussed ideas around the usefulness of neuroscience and psychology for artificial intelligence. Since then, he has released his book, Natural General Intelligence: How Understanding the Brain Can Help Us Build AI. And in the book, Chris makes the case that inspiration and communication between the cognitive sciences and AI is hindered by the different languages each field speaks. But in reality, there's always been, and still is, a lot of overlap and convergence about ideas of computation and intelligence. And he illustrates this using tons of historical and modern examples. So I was happy to invite him back on to talk about a handful of the topics in the book, although the book itself contains way more than we discuss. You can find a link to the book in the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/159. Thanks for listening. Here's Chris. I was just looking it up, and it was actually almost a year ago today that we spoke last. You were on with Sam Gershman, and it was mid-January. So I was just looking it up because I was thinking, what episode was that? When was that? And since then, you have published this bright, shiny new book, Natural General Intelligence. And I was, in the preface to the book, you write that it took you 10 months to write the book. And this is, there's so much in the book that's a blistering speed, it feels like, to write a book. But you also mentioned, hey, AI is, increasing, advancing at a super rapid pace. And so, one, how did you write the book that fast? And two, how much worry did you have that it would be immediately outdated, essentially, the AI facts in it, right? So neuroscience says, right? Psychology not advancing so fast, AI advancing very fast. So you didn't have to worry so much that you'd be outdated in your neuroscience, maybe.
Yeah. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, well, it didn't feel very fast when I was writing it, I can tell you. Maybe I don't know how long it takes people to write, but I think one of the reasons that I found it relatively easy to write, at least once I got going, was because some of the material is part of a course which I teach. So the sort of structure of the book and the kind of the conversations and the arguments and the things that I felt I needed to explain were sort of present, kind of in my mind. So yeah, that's one reason. And, kind of also, as purely incidentally, kind of, I just found that actually I really love writing. I think, kind of probably much better at writing than I am at actually doing other aspects of science. So I really enjoyed it. And, the synthetic process of, kind of getting those ideas down and trying to make sense of them was personally like hugely enriching. I'm sure many other people have that experience too. In terms of the book being out of date, yeah. So obviously, I would love people to read it.
It's not out of date, by the way.
I mean, kind of, I would love people to read it, but the neuroscience, of course, is not out of date, and the neuroscience, kind of, I still feel like neuroscientists are, to some extent, this ideas come out in machine learning and AI research, and it takes a while for them to percolate through to typically to the computational community, and then out into the sort of wider communities. And that process, kind of some of the models and ideas which are described in the book will be, kind of probably news to a lot of people working in mainstream neuroscience, and certainly to my kind of, the audience that I had in mind while I was writing, which is sort of like undergraduates who are interested in cognition and computation in the brain. So that's definitely true. But in terms of AI research and kind of the sort of what's new, sorry guys, but it was out of date. It was out of date 3 months after I submitted it, dramatically so. I actually, kind of OUP, OUP are actually a little bit faster to turn around books than some other publishers. But even so, kind of by the time it was due to go to production, which was I think in July 22, like 3 or 4 months after I submitted it, they said, well, hey, do you want to update it? Because has anything changed?
That's what I was going to ask.
I need to rewrite the whole thing. Sorry.
No, but did you? Were you at least in your mind? Were you thinking, do I need to go and see if a new model has been released and update it, or did you just say, screw it, this is what it is?
Well, I mean, kind of the the major thing. So obviously, GPT-3 was out while I was writing the book, and as was the initial Deepmind's initial model. So Gopher, their language model, was released while I was still writing the book. But both were, well, the language models, between the time when I submitted and the time when it went to production, we went from basically having a couple of language models to having a whole explosion of startups and so on. The other thing that changed dramatically was text to image generation. So when I was writing the book, there were a bunch of models. So there was the first version of DALL-E, and then there was Glide, which was this sort of, I can't remember.
I can't keep up. I can't
remember if that was Brain. No, I can't. I probably should know this, but I can't. Anyway, these early models, which, everyone was like, wow, that's incredible. But then compared to what came later, to what, DALL-E 2 in particular, and then Fusion, and now we have, all the others, they were a bit rubbish by comparison. So, kind of I had to go in and update all the figures in the book, because I'd had these figures of look what you can do with text to image generation. And, if they, now what we can do is much better. So, yeah.
It's almost like we need to change the format, and books need to be digital, where you can just plug in the latest creation, right? Figure 10.2, and it just refreshes every month or something.
Well, yeah, like in Harry
something.
Where the Harry Potter news is is animated. Yeah, I guess that would be great.
Yeah. So I didn't read the subtitle of the book. The title is Natural General Intelligence, and the subtitle is How Understanding the Brain Can Help Us Build AI. And throughout the book, you talk about the all of the principles in AI that can be kind of mapped onto some of the things that we have learned throughout the years in neuroscience. But of course, in the industry world in AI, a lot of people are fond of bragging that we don't need to pay attention to any natural intelligence. And look, we did this on our own, and you're actually learning from us. So sometimes it was the wording in the book was, I think you used the word inspired a few times, and sort of mapped them together. But it wasn't clear always whether the artificial intelligence advances were, how much attention they were actually paying to the natural intelligence research, right? So I don't know if you just want to comment on that, but because there are so many different, when you put them all together, there are so many different ways in which they kind of can map onto each other. But is it? I had the sense that AI world really was proud about not having paid attention to NI world, natural intelligence world. Do you think that's the case, or do you think that, I know in your world, in the Deepmind world and in your neuro AI kind of world, that is a celebrated aspect, but in AI world writ large, do you think that people feel the same?
Yeah, there's so much to say here. Let me see if I can order my thoughts and try and answer the question by parts.
Obviously mine aren't. Yeah.
So the first thing to say is let me answer a question which you didn't ask, which is about the converse direction, right? So has AI been useful to neuroscience? Unequivocally, yes, right? So, kind of our field, over the past few years has been dramatically invigorated by this kind of what people call like Neuro AI, or I don't know, they have different terms for it. But yeah, the advent of connectionist models in the form of deep learning architectures, recurrent architectures, increasingly deep RL, kind of like all of these ideas percolating into neuroscience has been great for the field, and it's sparked some interesting debates around kind of what are we trying to do in computation? Do we care about how much do we care about interpretability versus predictive validity for our models? Kind of what is an explanation of a neural system if it has 100 million parameters? Those kinds of questions, which have been very rich, and I think good for the field to have those debates. And kind of just computational ideas flowing into neuroscience, and that's great, and we can talk more about that. But let me try and answer the question that you did ask. So you asked about what people in machine learning and AI research think about the role of neuroscience or cognitive science and its relevance for their research. So there are many, many answers to this question because there are many diverse viewpoints. Let me try and answer the first, tackle one of them. And this is something that I hear quite often. So sometimes people in machine learning and AI research, particularly people who've entered the field more recently, say things like, it's not clear what we have ever learned from the brain, right, from the study of the brain. So this is, kind of in my view, this is this is an opinion which does not adequately reflect the influence that neuroscience has had on AI historically, right? So historically, from the very first symbolic AI models, right, which maybe today are somewhat out of fashion, but kind of the fields of psychology and then later cognitive science and neuroscience and AI research have been like kind of intricately intertwined in their goals, to sort of understand thinking and build a thinking machine. And then as we move into the era of connectionist models and then deep learning, obviously the structure of these models is inspired by neuroscience in the sense that, kind of network, they involve information processing in networks of neurons, albeit simplified networks of neurons, which obey many of the principles that we've learnt about from neuroscience. And the people who built the first successful models were either trained in psychology or neuroscience or explicitly, kind of have articulated how those ideas inspired them. And that continues to some extent up to the present day. So, if you think about the latest architectures, kind of LSTM models, recurrent neural networks and LSTM models, obviously have a very clear biological correlate or biological. I mean, I don't know if Jürgen Habermas would say that. Sorry, Schmidhuber would say Habermas is a philosopher. He didn't build any neural networks, as far as I know. But you
better get it right with Schmidhuber too, because he'll let you know, right? If you don't.
The comparison to Habermas is flattering, I think. But anyway, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if Schmidhuber would say that he was inspired by neuroscience, but it's clear that those, kind of there is an analogous current of thought in psychology and neuroscience about how working memory happens, which is really, really important. And then if you think about, even up to the current day, right? Think about meta learning, a really powerful approach, kind of directly inspired by ideas about prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia in a paper whose first and senior author were both neuroscientists. I think that historical trend is there and it continues to this day. Now, that doesn't mean that people in machine learning and AI research always appreciate that.
There are so many different things. I mean, like I wanted to jump in when you said LSTM because you tell the story about the mapping of LSTMs with the basal ganglia and the gating function account of basal ganglia. And actually, I don't know that I had even appreciated that connection. I mean, I know that LSTMs, of course, anytime you have a new model in AI, the neuroscience world kind of grabs it and says, maybe this is a model for how the cortical column works, which has been done with the LSTM also. But so I have tons of notes from your book, and we could talk, and we will talk about tons of topics. But to get us into that, I'm kind of wondering, along the process of you writing it, even though you wrote it at such breakneck speed, did you change your mind about anything, or did you come to appreciate anything, that stands out in your mind that you thought this way, and then, well, that's what changing your mind is. You thought this way about something, and then as you wrote about it and clarified your thoughts and learned more information, you learned that maybe you should think about it a different way, etc.
Yeah, I think probably not globally. I think, kind of really, but I think, the book does not, I didn't set out to kind of really espouse one viewpoint
Right.
or opinion, right? A lot of science books, including the ones, many that I know and love, what they do is they use a particular viewpoint as a way in to expose some problem. And, they make the book compelling through, how compelling their argument is in favor of this view, right? I could give you many examples. I didn't set out to do that, right? I wanted to give something which was a bit more balanced, and I wanted to give voice, in debates around like, how should we build AI, right? Like these perennial questions of like, what are the constraints that we need? Do we need really explicit constraints? Like some people have argued, for like symbolic style or variable binding style constraints. I tried to give voice to like both sides of the argument, and often to try and point out where I thought maybe they were sort of missing the point that each other was making. And kind of I often feel that my viewpoint maybe kind of this is just me, but I often feel that my viewpoint isn't sort of like, kind of where there's two kind of different camps. It's like, I'm strongly aligned to A or I'm strongly aligned to B. My viewpoint usually tends to be, when someone from A is evaluating ideas from camp B, this is where they miss the point, and vice versa, right? And my view is often about where two opposing positions converge or diverge, rather than necessarily strongly espousing one or the other.
Is part of that talking past each other? How much of it is talking past each other, and how much of it is a true staunch divide?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talking past each other, and there's a lot of semantics involved, right? I mean, in the debate, in the later chapters of the book, I make reference to a very, very long-standing debate, which relates to, the question of, as I mentioned, the question of whether we need constraints on our models, which are quite explicit. So, kind of cognitive scientists throughout the past 20 years, I mean, of course, before as well, but especially throughout the past 20 years, have, taken issue with the undifferentiated nature of the information processing in connectionist or deep learning models. And they've said we need things like explicit constraints. Those might be, kind of, they might be mechanisms which, kind of deliberately discretize information in ways that make it amenable to like composition or, kind of the sorts of discrete or rule-based processing that we have traditionally thought of as part of what humans do. And, kind of those people have very often kind of advocated for those types of constraints without asking the question of whether they implicitly emerge out of the types of architectures that we build anyway, right? So, kind of it's clear that neural networks can learn to perform, various classes of rule-based inference. And actually they can do so in highly structured ways under the right constraints and with the right inductive biases. And, kind of very often people from the symbolic camp have sort of said, rather than saying, oh, well, actually that validates my point that, kind of this form of computation is important, right? Instead, they've tried to focus on, identifying corner cases where neural networks fail and saying, well, kind of you haven't done it right. And, I think that's made the debate a little sterile. On the other side of the argument, kind of there's a sort of unpleasant kind of bradagio amongst machine learning researchers that is like, kind of a sort of muscular tendency to assert superiority because their models are, kind of they're more effective in an engineering sense, right? Because they actually do stuff. And to be really dismissive of ideas from cognitive science. And I think that's also equally unhelpful because as Jan LeCun, who's someone who's advocated for, of course, the deep learning approach, he's been not only one of the founders of that movement, but also kind of a spokesperson for that opinion. As he says, what does he say? Oh no, I've lost my train of thought.
Oh,
that's terrible.
He says more than a few things.
Well, he says more than a few things. I can't remember which one.
Is this pertaining to the nativist empiricist divide, the symbolic versus?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, as he says, kind of machine learning researchers are in the very business of building inductive biases into their model, right?
Right.
Kind of those cognitive scientists who've argued for a kind of a nativist, what's been billed as like a nativist approach, right? That we need to build in these constraints. What LeCun has said is, well, kind of machine learning advances through innovation on those very inductive biases, right? And that's literally, if you're a machine learning researcher, that's literally your day job, is to find those inductive biases. And I just think that's true, right? So the conversation has become, I think, kind of circular and a little boring sometimes.
But so you see, you point to inductive biases and talk about them at some length as, this middle ground, right? That the symbolic AI folks should acknowledge that there is built-in structure, the nativists, right? That there is built-in structure, that it's not just one big undifferentiated neural network. And on the other hand, I suppose the connectionists, which, as you say, Jan LeCun, who was, one of the first people off of Fukushima's neocognitron to start building that structure into the earliest convolutional neural networks, that there should be an acknowledgement that, and maybe there is already an acknowledgement, as you were saying, that the inductive biases are necessary to advance.
Yeah, exactly. And I think often and this is a point that I really tried to make in the book, kind of discussions around how we should build AI that don't account for what we're trying to build are essentially pointless, right? There is no right way to build AI. What there is there are solutions to particular problems. And, very often when people disagree, they're not actually disagreeing about the pathway to building the technology. What they're disagreeing about is what the problem is in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. And, when we talk about inductive biases, clearly debates about the extent to which we should handcraft in particular constraints or inductive biases, those are theories, not just of like what will work, right? They are theories of what will work in the context of a particular environment that you have in mind, right? Of course, you need to tailor the degree of constraint in your model to the open-endedness or diversity of the data that you want it to be able to process, right? So, if you only ever want the network to do one thing, then of course you should tailor it to do that one thing. It would be silly not to, right? If you want it to do lots and lots of things, then it needs to be very general. And the question is, how general is the natural world? If you imagine that what we want is to build something that, kind of behaves in the natural world, how general is the natural world? Well, of course, the natural world is, infinitely rich and complex, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have constraints too. And when we look at the inductive biases that have been successful, they tend to reflect properties of the natural world. So, in the natural world, I don't know, like time goes forwards. So it's pretty useful to have a memory system because that means that your behavior can be conditioned not only on the now, but also on the past, right? And the relevance of information in the past may not be like uniform across time, right? Things that happen recently tend to be more relevant than things that happen a long, long time ago. And there is a function that describes that relevance. And it's not necessarily, kind of completely linear as well. And that means that, we need not just one memory system, but multiple memory systems, right? We have memory systems which deal with the immediate past and memory systems that deal with the longer term. And that's reflected in the types of, it's reflected in our sort of psychology 101, like memory is modular, but it's also reflected in the structure of the inductive biases that we build into our models. And an LSTM is a great example, right? What it does is it says, well, actually we need to maintain information over two timescales in memory. One which is sort of ongoing and active, and one which can be placed into a kind of pending state and then released when needed. And that turned out to be a really good solution, probably because it matches a property of the world, right? That some information, you need to place in a pending state and then be able to use it when it comes up, which is very useful if you want to not lose your train of thought, for example.
Well, speaking of losing one's train of thought, I mean, I'm going to not, I was going to ask you about this later, but I'll just bring it up now because you were talking about the properties of the natural world. And this comes toward the end of your book when you're talking about artificial general intelligence. And you a moment ago were mentioning about what you build depends on the problem that you want to solve. And I mean, you talk about Umwelts in the book, which is the term given to, the relationship essentially between an organism or an agent, I suppose, an artificial agent, and it's the environment that it's dealing with, its capabilities within that environment. And its perceptual world is built around its scale, its needs, its desires. An ant has a very different Umwelt than we do. And in, not the same breath, but you also talk about affordances, which is that relationship based on like what we can do based on the properties of the natural world. We can reach for an apple based on our abilities and the accessibility of the apple and our abilities to eat it and consume it and so on. And I've just been pondering the usefulness of creating artificial intelligence in the guise of humans, and whether an AGI or any AI could ever have be exposed to the same things that we're exposed to, right? Because you also talk about homeostatic needs. Why would we want an AI to ever have homeostatic needs? And homeostatic needs shape the problem. Okay, this is always coming back to the problem that we're solving, which is staying alive, reproducing, right? The problems that we're solving, why would we want to build anything to solve those same problems? To essentially have the same structure and relationship with the natural world. I'm sorry that was a long-winded commentary and question or
no,
yeah.
It's clear. I mean, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, kind of at the root is the question of like, kind of what do we want to build and why? And the answers to that have changed, and they've changed in a way which reflects our different theories of cognition and our different understanding of biology. So, kind of when people set out to build AI in the first place, kind of the goals that they set themselves were very, very divorced from like the everyday structure of the environment, right? So kind of if you think of the initial like reasoning systems, kind of whether it was like kind of systems for proving theorems through pure logic, or systems for kind of playing games like chess or whatever. These are pursuits which are kind of very divorced from the kind of quotidian embedding in the natural world with kind of that's characterized by bodily movements and interactions with social others and so on, right? And so naturally, it was quite easy to have a paradigm that says, okay, well, humans can do X, so let's try and build something that does X, right? And that was the initial paradigm, and that paradigm kind of continued on into kind of the deep learning era, in which suddenly we have models which are grounded in much more naturalistic settings. And here, an anomaly arises because what we have is we're still in the mindset where like, okay, the goal is to like recreate a human, right? But suddenly we're like in the natural world. And then it's like, okay, so we want to recreate a human in the natural world, right? And then this suddenly starts to be a bit weird, right? Because it's like, why would we want to do that? Like already, there are 8 billion people on the planet.
Right. Right.
If you want to create humans, it's actually not that hard to create new humans, although, it does take two of you and a little bit of time.
Sometimes it's hard. But I get what you're saying. Yes.
So you're absolutely right to point that out. Yeah, so it's not always simple or straightforward for everyone. But in general, on average, we as a population, we have been able to kind of to populate the planet without recourse to AI. So yeah, I mean the question is where do we sit now, right? And how do we reconcile this idea of like that the goal of AI building is somehow agenthood, like the recreation of human agenthood, with the kind of much more general problem of like, what would we actually do with the system if we got it, right? And it becomes relevant because as we realize more and more that our intelligence human intelligence is grounded in those very facets of our behavior, which are like kind of not really, the slightly esoteric, kind of ability to reason about abstract problems or whatever, but are also grounded in, things like how we interact with each other socially, or even grounded in like, movements of our body, right? Object recognition is part of object recognition is not just being able to attach a label to something, but being able to pick it up, right? And when we take that on board, then suddenly we ask ourselves the question, well, if we built these systems, would they actually have the same bodies as us? Well, maybe, but maybe not. And then you ask, well, would they have the same like social life as us? And then you're like suddenly into super weird territory. So, almost certainly not, right? I mean, unless we get into sort of weird science fiction territory.
Yeah, no, it would, I mean,
right.
I don't know, self-organizing systems, et cetera, always come back to, to this, well, let's say an attractor state or something. But I just can't imagine that trying to emulate humans in building an AI, the affordances, the Umwelt, the problems to solve, the whole collection of problems to solve is going to be so different that it has to be a very different kind of intelligence.
Right. So that's the argument, right? So if you cut out those things, if our intelligence depends upon, how we interact with the world physically and socially, and we a priori just kind of don't want to build an agent that would share those properties, then it means that its intelligence will be different from ours. In the same way that kind of I love. There's a book by a primatologist called Frans de Waal, very well-known primatologist, called "Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?" It's a well-known, very successful popular science book. I love that book, and basically, it's a sort of it's a story of anecdotes from across his career, and really good experimental research as well, which shows that broadly, animals are incredibly smart, but they're just not smart on our terms, right? And we deem them as being less smart than us because they're not smart in the way that we are smart, right? And I think when we evaluate the intelligence of AI, it's often exactly the same thing. We sort of say, oh, well, this agent isn't smart because it doesn't understand this thing that we humans understand. And, kind of, well, often there's no reason why it should, right? Because, it doesn't go to the opera or, didn't go to dinner parties or do whatever humans do, kind of many, many other ways of interacting with each other, of course. But yeah, and so we wouldn't expect it to share our intelligence. So the paradigm's changing. It has changed. And people are realizing that now, I think.
Maybe before, well, yeah, sorry, I'm just jumping around, but I'm just taking cues off of what you're talking about to talk about more things that you discuss in the book. And one is the concept of intelligence. And we were just talking about how we have a very particular kind of intelligence, and we define all other animals and AI agents based on our notion of intelligence. But our notion of intelligence has changed. The focus of what we have considered intelligent behavior and thought has changed over the years. And I don't know if you want to just kind of step through a few of the ways that it's changed, but and or just acknowledge that it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, I think maybe there's one thing to say. So, I worried a lot about what to call the book. And I wanted to call it Natural General Intelligence, by analogy with artificial general intelligence, obviously. But there was something that really put me off the title, and that was the word intelligence itself, because that word has a really bad rep, and with reason, right? And that's because, the whole notion that, intelligence is this sort of, this essence of individuals that we can use that we can quantify, and we can use to categorize people as maybe having more of it or less of it and so on, has rightly, kind of been viewed as like, kind of elitist and discriminatory, and more than just being viewed as that, kind of intelligence testing, the psychometric measurement of intelligence has, not so much latterly, but certainly throughout the 20th century, has been used to basically, kind of reinforce cultural stereotypes, and worse, right? Some of the earliest uses of intelligence testing were related to, eugenic theories about who should and should not be allowed to reproduce, right? So,
those were bad?
Wait,
kind of, hang on.
Yeah. So rightly, the word intelligence, I think, turns people off. And, kind of, I do try to highlight that in my book. And I highlight it a little bit sort of by analogy, but with the point that I made about our failure to understand animal intelligence, right? That from the perspective of the sort of, the Western ivory tower in the developed world, kind of very often it is an utter failure to understand the situatedness of intelligence in other cultures or other modes of behavior that has led to, kind of discrimination and bias in the way that we think about other people, right? And that you can see that in the history of intelligence testing, which is a pretty, dismal. It's a pretty dismal history in some ways. I mean, I'm sure that we have learned things about, kind of the structure of cognitive ability, and I wouldn't want to take away from those who work in that area, but I'm sure everyone who's working in that area today would acknowledge that it has a darker side, and I think it is the reflection of exactly the same point that I was making about, kind of our failure to appreciate animals' abilities.
First of all, maybe there should be a caveat when defining intelligence, and you talk about the common Legg and Hutter definition. They collected 50 or so different definitions of intelligence and kind of whittled it down to a very small ability to adapt in new environments, I believe. Something, I'm paraphrasing, but maybe the little footnote should be, given the particular set of problems of the agent or organism, because it does depend on the problem state, the set.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think AI research has, kind of, as I said, maybe this is an unfair and sweeping generalization, but coming from cognitive science, but spending time with machine learning and AI researchers, I often feel that, kind of in machine learning and AI research, they're much better at the solution than they are at the problem, right? Mm-hmm. So, kind of, people are really good at kind of finding inventive solutions to particular problems, right? But they're much less good at thinking about what the relevance of that particular problem is in the first place. The whole field is structured around benchmark tests, right? But nobody really asks where these benchmark tests come from or what they mean. I mean, people do, but, kind of it's not the sort of day-to-day topic of conversation. Whereas in cognitive science, you could almost make the opposite, right? People spend so much time worrying about the problem that they don't actually build models that are any good. Which of course is another untrue sweeping generalization. But, if you wanted to characterize the model continuum, that would be one way of thinking about, kind of what the difference between the
two is. We'll get into talking about like the current state of reinforcement learning models later, but what do there's a large push these days in reinforcement learning for agents, and you talk about this in the book, to use more ecologically valid tasks, right? So there's a lot of game playing in like navigational maze type spaces and playing multiplayer games. What do you see as the current state of that? I mean, is that close enough to ecological validity? Are we still super far away? And again, with the caveat that it depends on what we're trying to do, right? But assuming we're trying to build like some human-like agents or something.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot to say here. So reinforcement learning has been one of the dominant paradigms within machine learning and AI research for 40 years now, or something like that. And, it kind of grew out of the methods in RL grew out of an approach which was to try and solve control problems, essentially, right? These are problems in which there's a relatively clearly defined objective. And what's difficult is to work out how to get there, right? And what RL does is it uses various methods, some of them based on sort of, kind of learning, kind of stored values for states or actions, and some of them based on, sort of explicit search methods. But it uses a variety of approaches to try to satisfy a well-defined objective. So that's why RL lends itself so nicely to things like playing Go, right? Because there's a well-defined objective, like, well, I mean, we can talk about what the objectives might be. There are many objectives actually when we play games, but it's easy to make the assumption that the objective is just to win. And if you make that assumption, then RL is wonderful, right? And so, kind of in video games, we also have a clearly defined objective. Most of them have a score, and you keep on going. You try to maximize your score, and then you get on the leaderboard. And if you die, then it's game over, and you got to start again. So it's very clear. But life is just not like that, right? So there isn't in life. Nobody says, kind of this was your score for today, right?
Sometimes, but yeah.
Well, do they? I mean, not in real
general world setting, not in general. Yeah.
Yeah. You might get a score. You get a score for specific things, right? Maybe you're very happy because you did well in your exams or whatever. But like, you don't get a score for like,
a daily
I don't know
score.
How nice you were.
Yeah.
How nice you were to your colleagues, or like, kind of whether like you enjoyed the sunshine, or, kind of what you don't get a score for what life is really about, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the paradigm is hard to translate. It's really hard to translate. And yeah, there's no final point when you just win at life, right? It would be nice, but there isn't. So what actually happens in the real world, and this is a huge paradox, right? Because we have this paradigm, and RL, of all of the paradigms that we have in machine learning and AI research, RL is the one that's had the biggest impact on psychology and neuroscience, right? Because it grew up in this intertwined fashion with animal theories of animal learning, and we know that the neurophysiology of subcortical, to some extent cortical systems is a really good match to what is actually implemented in successful algorithms, which have these optimality guarantees, which are really nice and whatever. So there's this beautiful, beautiful story, but at the same time, like the whole paradigm is just a convenient fiction, right? It's just not true. Like there are no in RL. RL is when you build an RL model, what you're doing is you're working within a paradigm called the Markov decision process, and within that paradigm, you have these things called observations, which are like sensory data, and these things called rewards, which are what you're trying to ultimately maximize over, some theoretical future discounted. And they're different things, right? But in the real world, this is just not true. There is no difference between the taste of the apple and the reward of the apple, right? The reward of the apple is its taste, right? Or maybe it's the feeling of, kind of the satisfaction that you have when you were hungry and you're less hungry anymore. But that itself also is a sensation, right? There are no rewards. There's just observations, right? So,
but
the RL paradigm is in the real world.
But the reinforcement learning world would want to map reward onto, let's say, relative level of dopamine, right? With unexpected value or something. And because that's the computational push to map it onto a tangible, effable value. But you're talking about qualia and the feelings. And so we don't have quantification of our feeling of awe yet, right? And but
it's not about qualia. It's not subjective. It's
well,
about the flow of information. In RL, rewards come from the world, right? The environment, it's like the researcher
right.
decides that apple is worth 10 points. And when you eat it, you get 10 reward points. When you have when there's an increase in your dopaminergic signal, that's not like the environment impinging directly on the brain to produce that signal. That signal is produced by the agent.
That's
It's
autonomy.
the agent that decides.
Yeah.
The agent decides what's good and what's not, right? But the reason why this is really difficult in the RL paradigm is that it leads to chaos. Because if I can just decide what's good and what's bad, and then I'm just like, well, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to decide that like sitting on the sofa and watching TV is like, is good, and that's fine, and I'll just be happy forever until, kind of I die of hunger and thirst or whatever, right? I don't mind because I'm having a great time sitting on the sofa. So it wouldn't, but then, that is the problem, is that in reinforcement learning, kind of we often distinguish between like extrinsic and intrinsic rewards, right? And the salvation of the RL paradigm is that, kind of we can still think about rewards in the natural world, but those rewards must be intrinsic, which is that they must be generated by the agent, not by the world. And the question is, computationally, how did we evolve constraints that shape those intrinsic rewards so that our behavior is still adaptive, even though we are deciding what's valuable and what's not? And so, kind of, I'm not saying that RL is wrong. It's just that the simple story about extrinsic rewards and that map onto the video game or the chess playing or Go playing example just doesn't work. You need a different paradigm.
But you don't think that to have an intrinsic reward, that an agent needs to be quote unquote truly autonomous, and then we get into the territory of, well, is that even possible if they're living in a simulation that we programmed through the computer that we built and programmed?
Yeah, well, this is the difficulty, right? Which is that, kind of one of the reasons why it's nice to control the agent's behavior with extrinsic rewards is that the researcher has really tight control over the objectives, right? In theory, right? It's like you can say, kind of, this is what I want the agent to do, right? Within limits. I mean, the agents can still learn to do things that you weren't expecting, right? That's, you have these things called specification gaming or whatever. But if you let the agent make up its own reward function, then you're sort of in unknown territory, right?
How do you do
the
that?
agent then is going to learn to do whatever, and then that's where you get into issues of safety and kind of because if the agent just if you build an intrinsic function, like you say, oh, I just want my agent to be curious, right? If you have an extrinsic reward, which is like kind of please win this game or please eat lots of apples, then you can be pretty sure that the agent is going to do something like that, right? That doesn't mean there aren't safety concerns there, as many people have reminded us, but the safety concerns, if the agent is making up its own value function, are much more severe, or trying to satisfy something like let's just have control over the world, right? Then it's like, oh, okay, well, there's lots of ways to have control over the world. Some of them might not be so good for people.
But okay, so this kind of harkens, and we'll go down the reinforcement learning path a little bit more here, and then we'll jump back out. You mentioned the reward is enough hypothesis, which was a paper written a few years ago. I think the title was "Reward is Enough." It basically, is a siren call that all we really need for true AI, quote unquote, is reward. But then that gets in the definition of what a reward is. And you were saying there aren't rewards separate from objects. And then you can make the concept of reward so deflationary, right? So if you say, instead of programming in reward, you give it some intrinsic reward by giving it curiosity, right? But then you can just call curiosity reward, and then the word reward becomes meaningless. So I don't know, but I guess I'm just asking for your comments on, you argue against the idea that reward is enough, but you were just saying that to give an agent intrinsic reward, it could go into chaos. But then I don't know what intrinsic reward is, if it's curiosity or if it's control, and or whether, because you're still programming it to maximize something. There's still an objective function that you give it. So it's not its own objective function, right? The agent can't come up with its own objective function. Question mark.
Yeah. So clearly these issues are sometimes a bit hard to wrap your head around, right? So I think that paper is actually making a claim which I don't agree with, but I think it's a slightly different claim from what it actually says in the title, right?
Of course.
The title maybe is a little bit of hyperbole. What the claim really is, I think, is that because of course you can define anything as a reward function, right? So you can say, okay, well, if it's intrinsic rewards, then kind of maximizing my knowledge, or doing really good prediction in my generative model, right? These are my intrinsic objectives, and their reward, I can write them down as reward, and then I just maximize that, and kind of everything. So the argument that there is a version of that claim which feels unfalsifiable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think what they're actually saying is that reward function, when you write it down, will be simple. That's the nature of the claim in that paper, is that it's simple enough that you could, as a researcher, as an AI researcher, you could write it down. There's some like magic formula which is sufficiently compact, right, that you write down, please, Mr. Agent, please, or Mrs. Agent, please will you optimize this, 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 and this, right? And it's sufficiently simple that by just doing that, you get intelligent behavior. And you don't have to, this is an example I give in the book, like you don't have to then, go through the world like the games designer of Atari games go through, like assigning rewards to particular states, like eating apples or whatever. You don't have to go through the natural world as an AI researcher and assign 10 points for seeing a beautiful sunset and, 30 points for, I don't know, going to the football match or whatever. Because that would just, because obviously nobody has time to do that, right? And actually it would take far more time to design a reward function in that way than it would just,
do it,
kind of to build a stupid that does it.
Right? Yeah.
So it's a claim, that paper makes a claim about the simplicity of the reward function, which I think, is a defensible claim. And the people who wrote that paper, very, very, very accomplished and researchers who've thought very deeply about this problem for many years, so it shouldn't be dismissed. I personally do not think that I do not think that there is a simple extrinsic or a simple reward function of any form that could be written down, the maximization of which is just going to inevitably lead to intelligence.
Do you think that we are not algorithmic then, in that sense? That, as we develop, right, our reward functions change. And as when we walk in a new room and there's a new problem to solve and there's only a screwdriver to solve it, is it an algorithm that determines, hey, that's a metal screwdriver, so I can connect these two wires to turn the light on? Because the function of a screwdriver changes, So I'm harking it back to now Stuart Kaufman's example of the next adjacent possible, I think it's called, where essentially the argument is that we're not algorithmic because in a given situation, everything that we've learned in the world, these static concepts through, computational steps, you still wouldn't know how to use. A screwdriver could still be used for a new purpose in a different setting, right? And in that sense, it's fundamentally not algorithmic. And your objective function then has to change, essentially, to be able to use that screwdriver. I'm kind of mixing words here. But anyway, are you suggesting then that we would not be able to write down one equation, however complicated it is, that would lead to intelligence via the reward is enough hypothesis?
I think I do agree that we can't do that, but I would maybe put it slightly differently. I mean, I'm not quite
Please.
sure I understand what you mean by algorithmic, but maybe that's because I haven't read Stuart Kaufman. It sounds like I should. But the, I think there's another way of putting my perspective, which is, in all of machine learning, we use an optimization paradigm, right? So there's some objective which is specified, right? And then the agent gradually converges towards that objective, or not, right? Things go wrong, but kind of ideally they converge towards that objective. And then, kind of almost irrespective of which paradigm you're working in, there's an assumption that they do so in a general enough way through the heterogeneity of the training set, the diversity of their experience, that you can then, kind of take them and you can plonk them in new and different environments, and they will, kind of, they will behave with similar levels of performance, right? But, kind of what this assumes is that the agent is somehow going to be able to sample, kind of to take many samples from the training distribution and model the training distribution adequately, where the training distribution here corresponds to, kind of the set of experiences which it would be possible to have, right? And I think that that's just not how it works in life, right? Because we don't stick around for all that long, right? We only get to have one life, and for most people, that life comprises only a tiny, tiny, tiny subset of the possible experiences that we could have, right? And so that whole sort of, there's a global optimum for life, and we're all just trying to optimize towards it. I think that paradigm is just not really applicable to the natural world. I think instead what happens is that we sort of make a lot of stuff up on the fly. So, I really feel like what we do is we optimize very, very locally, like very, very locally, and in a really kind of like forgetful way a lot of the time, right?
I do, yeah.
We get good. We get locally good at some stuff, and then, we go off, we formulate some views, or we learn some policies and we put them into practice. But then things change because the world is really open-ended, right? And
yeah.
We're not that good at dealing with change, right? We don't behave like an agent. When I visit a new city, if I'm adept at behaving in that city, it's not because I have such a diverse set of experiences of all the possible things that a new city could throw up that I can just transfer zero shot. Rather, what happens is when I go to a new city, I have a set of like reasonable but very, very blunt priors, and I sort of rapidly assemble them to kind of, just about get by, probably misunderstanding a lot of stuff, and probably, being incredibly inefficient. And then, then I go home and I probably forget most of it, and then I solve another problem. So the whole like optimization towards convergence paradigm, I just don't think it works all that well in the natural world. Maybe you could think of it working for evolution, but for learning over the course of a single lifetime, a single individual, I just don't think it's all that useful.
You also, when you go to a new city and you haphazardly get by, you end up at a coffee shop, and maybe it's okay, and then later you tell yourself, oh, I did that well, when it was perhaps, we lie to ourselves. And you were kind of alluding to, I think it's Nick Chater's book that you talk about in your book, about how, a flat mind, right? We have flat minds.
Flat, yeah.
The mind is flat, which is a section in your book. So I like that example. But you do, so a few times in the book, you say, this is one of the biggest challenges in AI these days. And one of those is finding the right mix and match of reward functions. I don't know if you want to just say a few words about that, because given that we were talking about reinforcement learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question, maybe not even for AI research, but it's an interesting question for neuroscience, right? Mm-hmm. Like to think about, kind of RL clearly has given us a useful paradigm for thinking about learning, even if the caveats that I just raised, kind of apply. But I think it's useful to think about what should we actually optimize for, right? Kind of what are the objectives, kind of in a world in which we make
to win. That's the objective.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You think of the other thing about RL. Let me say something else that I think is relevant, which is the other thing about RL is that, that's a bit weird in the way it's typically implemented and used, is that rewards, when you get them, they're not fungible, right? So an asset which is fungible means that you can store it and disperse it at a later time, right? So like money, right? So I can put it in the bank and then spend it later. But that doesn't happen in like if you think of a deep RL agent playing Atari, right? It gets reward, but the reward just goes to its score, right? The reward like augments its score and it like updates its value function and so on. But you can't like when I encounter assets in the natural world, then kind of typically an action which is available to me is to kind of store them in some way so I can use them. This happens even with like primary reinforcers, right? So if you think of what food does, right? Food isn't like something which is like instantly dispersed, ping, right? What it does is it improves your calorie. It has calories which like and it has nutrients which like kind of your body uses over various different timescales to support itself, right? So it's dispersed in that way. The same with kind of economic assets, right? They're used gradually over time. So kind of there's this notion that what actually matters in the world are inputs which change our bodily state in various ways. That's what I do when I'm eating an apple. I'm changing my bodily state. And, in RL, that's all in the world. And you could say, okay, yeah, because maybe that's a state which I can observe and so on. And clearly everything, you can always shoehorn everything into an RL paradigm if you want to. But like, I think that the point here is that, kind of we need to think more in neuroscience about what it means to learn those actions to learn rewards for observations as a function of their consequence for our bodily state, right? And that then you suddenly get into all sorts of interesting territory, like kind of about mental health, kind of because of course sort of failures to appropriately learn intrinsic rewards for states, you can imagine that as being being tied to various kind of psych disorders, maybe depression and its comorbidities. We also need to learn things like intrinsically we need control, right? So control is very useful because it tells us that when we're being efficacious and when we're not, right? This is something really, really important. And similarly, we need to learn policies which exert the right level of control, right? And there's a lot of evidence that kind of having that control is something that really ties heavily into a sort of kind of healthy mood states and healthy psychology. Of course, if you seek to have too much control or too little control, then that can be tied to pathological states, right? So kind of one way of thinking about. I'm not an expert in psychiatry or computational psychiatry, but you can see the connection to things like obsessive compulsive disorder, for example. So I think these things are really interesting, and they're not very deeply explored from that computational perspective in psychology and neuroscience. And I think that's a big opportunity.
So that's what you mean by the right balance and mix of the right reward functions.
Yeah, exactly. And to try and understand what people really want, right? Like I think, kind of it's a silly question, but like, what do people want?
That's the problem, is we don't know that, we can't really define intelligence outside of our own problem space, and even individually our problem spaces are different, right? And we can't say what we want, and what we want changes. What we claim to want anyway changes. And is that what we really want? Yeah.
Well, that's Nick Chater's point in the Mind is Flat book, right? Which is that we don't really have something. It's similar to my we don't really optimize point. And full disclosure, I'm hugely influenced by reading Nick's work and also talking to him about it. He's such an inspiration for me. But yeah, he says we don't really have a value function, and we just we sort of make up what we want.
Isn't that pessimistic?
Is not entirely true. Like we probably if you were water deprived for 2 days, you probably really would want a glass of water, and people really do care about each other, and there are things that we really do preferences that we really do have, but a lot of our preferences are just kind of arbitrary.
Especially if we're all satiated and happy and healthy, you can make up whatever preferences you want. Exactly. Nick Chitter's
but even in those, even in states of need, right? I mean, people will go to extraordinary lengths.
Yeah.
Kind of people will go to, well, they will suffer extraordinary privation in pursuit of some like abstract ideal, which
Yeah.
they've just kind of, well, I mean, you could say it's made up. I mean, it's made up in a sense, right?
Well, we don't know,
Yeah.
right? It's a problem with the ontology of the universe, I suppose. And our now we're I'm pushing us a little too far, I
Those
suppose.
questions are above my pay grade. You need to get a philosopher on here to answer this. I'm sure
Oh,
you've
yeah.
had many good.
Yeah. Well, no one. Yeah. Yes, and they all have the correct answer. All right. So I'm going to jump now again toward the end of your book when So before we were talking about reinforcement learning, we were talking about the nature of intelligence and the nature of the problems that we're solving, and I was questioning whether an AGI could ever have our intelligence because the nature of their problems are just going to be different. And why would you create another human? Number 8 billion, 7 million, blah, blah, blah. But you talk about the notion of going, beyond our brains, right? Building intelligences that are superior to our brains, not human-like necessarily, not human level necessarily, but moving beyond. And whether that's wise, and of course, there's all sorts of ethical things that you touch on when you write about that as well. But I'd just like to ask you, like, what for me, having read your book and thinking about these things, some of the things that I've been mentioning, that idea does not sound unappealing, nor does it sound impossible, given that we have our own faults and errors, and presumably we wouldn't need to build an AI system with those faults and errors. And even if it's an intelligence radically different than ours that we don't necessarily understand, if it's solving problems in a problem space that is not our human problem space, but is a problem space that we want to enter into, I don't see, except for the paperclip destroyer example, I don't see why we wouldn't do that, and why it wouldn't be possible.
Yeah. So I mean, there are many answers to this question. So the first one is that in narrow domains, of course, we have already built things that are better than humans.
Calculator.
In many ways, right? Yeah, my calculator is better at maths than me, at least at calculation. AlphaGo is better at Go than everyone. And, my bet is that ChatGPT is probably more knowledgeable than any other that exists on the planet right now. That doesn't mean it's always right, as people have been, obviously quick to point out, but it probably is on balance, like better at answering general knowledge questions than any of the other 8 billion humans. I think that's probably a defensible claim. I might have to think about it a bit more.
Well, another point that you mentioned is that we always compare it to like the super expert in whatever domain we're talking about, right? So we would compare a language model to Hemingway or something like that, and not the average person. So,
yeah, no, for sure. So the question, kind of, we rapidly get entangled in questions of like, what do we want and what's right and so on. So there's many ways to answer this question. I mean, one is to counterpoint two different approaches, which I counterpoint in the book a little bit. And this is a sort of, in the beginning, you asked me this question about, kind of neuroscience and its role in AI. And there's another way in which psychology and neuroscience are relevant for AI research. And it's around the role, not of like theories of psychology, but the role of like human data and human data collection.
Okay.
And this is a counterpoint to, we talked about like, kind of how if you want to build something that plays Go or chess really well, then, kind of you can use RL. It's a very clear problem. And actually, what we learned in the process of solving Go, for example, was that you can do better if you stop using human data. Right? So part of the RL is enough claim is also about that, right? It's sort of saying like, you don't need to copy people. You just need to get the reward function right. And then everything else with enough computation and blah, 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 will take care of itself. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's exemplified by, kind of the story of AlphaGo, which, many people will be familiar with, but, kind of basically, AlphaGo originally was built by, there was a lot of, it was bootstrapped off a lot of supervised training from human play, essentially.
Right.
And kind of lots of Go games scraped from the internet, and kind of predictions about which moves were likely to lead to, which moves did lead to a win, conditional on how the humans play. And then later the team, kind of got rid of that that human element and just built something that played with itself. And there it was able to do even better. Right? And that's the foundation for the story, that kind of what we don't want humans in the loop at all, right? But I think that the advent of language models, large generative models, and so on, have really pushed our thinking back in the opposite direction. So it's back towards the idea that actually what we really do want is something that learns to be what humans want. So in other words, the ultimate reward function, it's not like you write down something clever, like, oh, be as curious as you can, or, kind of be as powerful as you can, or whatever, and you just let it loose and it takes over the world. Actually, what you want is an agent which is exquisitely sensitive to social feedback. And lo and behold, just like we are, right? So, kind of the really hard thing about being human is that, it's difficult to know what other people want and what other people think, because it's not written on their faces, at least not, very clearly. And so very often you say things that offend people, or that, kind of that other people don't like, or you fail to anticipate their needs or their desires or their beliefs, and you get stuff wrong. And that's what makes it really hard to be a person, right? So we learn over the course of development to be really, really sensitive to social feedback from one another.
This seems somewhat related to inverse reinforcement learning. Is that Stuart Russell's inverse reinforcement learning, where the idea is to learn the preferences of the human. That's kind of a related idea.
Well, it's related to value alignment in general,
yeah.
Right? So, kind of the objective, I think we're increasingly realizing that if we want AI that people will actually use and engage with in the way that, kind of people really, kind of engage with and are starting to use these language technologies for a range of different applications. If we want that, then, kind of the signal that we really care about is the social feedback. And, kind of that's not something which was a priori obvious, I think, kind of throughout the history of AI research, deep learning research, in which it was always the researcher that set the objective, right? But, we've been talking about, throughout this conversation, we've been talking about how, the natural world doesn't tell you, what's good and what's bad and whether you've won. And that's true to some extent, but social others, right? Social others provide you with dense feedback, which is really, really important, and which we have learnt to interpret in ways which, are obviously hugely consequential for how we behave, right? And so, yeah. So this is what is happening, right? So, the new method, which people call RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, is like taking over. It's learning to do this well is what everyone is, kind of excited about right now, I think, because this is the answer to building models which are gonna like really be preferred by people and be useful to people. Now, that doesn't mean you sidestep all of the thorny problems around value alignment or like fairness, for example, because, as soon as you say, okay, well, our agent is going to be trained to satisfy human preferences, it's like, well, whose preferences, right? So, you don't want it to be, is it going to be the preferences only of like educated Western people? How do we know that the preferences of like historically marginalized groups are properly weighted in this? What happens when people want different things, right? What happens when you have like majority minority and dynamics, and you have dissenting views, and who does the agent satisfy? So kind of this is, I think, where the action is right now. And so I don't talk about this really very much in the book, but this is actually the research that my group does at Deepmind.
Okay.
And so for many years we worked on these problems of like value alignment, group alignment, preference aggregation, And, I'm really gratified that now that we have good models like in the wild, or, kind of almost in the wild, that these issues are kind of coming to the fore. Because maybe you should think of another podcast, which is like, kind of about the relationship between AI and social science, because, kind of, I really feel that is as exciting a frontier as the one, the membrane between neuro and AI, which you've done so much to, to highlight.
Oh, someone should do that podcast. I can't fit it, man. You said you didn't really talk about that much in the book. Another thing that so I'm aware of our time, and I have like this long list of questions. So I'm trying to like sort of prioritize what to ask you. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you, we started off talking about, large language models and foundation models, which you allude to in the book a lot. But when it comes to like the transformers, and your book is, largely all about comparing AI and neuro and inspiration back and forth, and how we can use neuro for AI. But then you kind of have a one-off line where you say, well, it's really not clear yet how these awesome new models compare to the way to our psychology and our brains. And there have been a few studies comparing like fMRI and EEG, and that we are prediction machines, just like the transformer models. And so it's kind of early days in that. But I wonder if you have more thoughts on that since publishing the book, or just, if you think transformers are getting further away from our brains, or if they're actually closer to our brains and psychology than we are appreciating at the moment.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So people have done really nice work taking transformer models and comparing to the brain, sort of somewhat by analogy with the way that people sort of compared convolutional neural networks in the ventral stream system. And lo and behold, there are commonalities. And, you might say, oh, that's expected because, they're both predicting the same thing. So, presumably it's the semantic information being predicted that is the root cause of the shared representation. So maybe it's not that surprising, but it's not to detract from the importance of that work. I think it's been a really nice brick in the wall. But you're asking a deeper question, which is like, why the hell are transformers so good? So nobody knows why transformers are so good, but they are so good. They're really, really, really good. And, kind of it's clear that the step change that has happened since 2019 in generative models is not just about scale, it's about the transformer. So here's a theory, and this is, kind of it's sort of my theory, but it's really heavily inspired by other people, in particular the work of James Whittington and Tim Behrens, who have thought about this very carefully and probably in more detail than me. And if you think about what a transformer does, what it does is, it takes information, for example, in a sentence, and rather than receiving bits of information one by one, what it does is it takes a chunk of information and it kind of buffers it. And what it learns are essentially learns kind of a set of, it's called self-attention, but it essentially learns a set of like cross mappings between the information which is provided in the sequence and, critically, the positions in the sequence that information occupies, right? So you actually have in a transformer explicit representation of not only the contents, not only what is in the sentence or the image or whatever, but where it is, right? And this is very different from like an LSTM, because in an LSTM, time is there, but it's implicit, right? You just get the things bit by bit in time. You never learn to represent time itself, right? But the transformer actually affords the opportunity to represent position in the sequence, which if you're doing language going forward is time, right? Or space in an image. So what we have suddenly is,
even though a transformer is not recurrent, like technically.
Well,
sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you define recurrent, but it certainly does not have certainly does not have, it does not maintain information through recurrent dynamics in that way, right?
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely fine. But anyway, I think that the key element here, what I think is really important, is that you have explicit representations of contents and position, which we might call like structure, Like, where is everything in relation to everything else? So why is that important? Well, it's important because several people, including Tim Behrens and a number of other people, you could probably credit Christian Dola with some of these ideas. And my group has very explicitly kind of made this claim as well, which is that it is the explicit representation of space in either a navigational sense or a kind of like peripersonal space, like, the space that's around you, that explicit representation of space, which is really important for doing kind of complex forms of reasoning. And the argument goes something like the following, right? It's a little bit dense, but let me see if I can explain it. So I'll explain the theory that we articulated, which is not in terms of allocentric space or navigation. It's in terms of like reaching and grasping. So, imagine you want to learn a very simple abstraction, like the concept of three, right? So three, what does three mean? Three means that there are three objects in a scene, right? Okay, so we understand the concept of three. And what I mean by understand the concept of three is that if you saw a new scene that had three objects that you had never seen before, right? Completely new objects, you would still know there are three of them, right? So that means that your knowledge of three is independent of like the contents of the scene, right? Quite an explicit way, right? And so how do you actually learn that? It's really hard to think about how a neural network would learn that, because what neural networks learn, of course, are just statistical mappings between inputs and outputs, right? So, it's hard to know if you take three new and completely different objects, they'd be out of distribution. So how would you ever learn that? Well, one argument is that what you do is you use the way in which you interact with the scene, so your action, as an input to the system. And by using that as an input to the system, so by explicitly representing how you can move, what you're doing is you're effectively constructing space. Like three objects only exist in three different locations because you can move. What that means is that you can move to them and pick them up in different places or move their eyes to them. And those are different locations that you've moved your eyes to. So the idea is that our knowledge of abstractions is formulated through the actions that we take in space. And it's by taking those actions in space that we learn an explicit representation of space. It means we actually have codes for space, which is, of course, primate. That's what's there in the dorsal stream, right? We have these things called salience maps, which are intricately tied with, kind of like the representations of where objects are in space. So that explicit representation of space, we argue, is really important for like kind of basically being able to reason about objects and being able to compose scenes from different combinations of objects in different spatial positions. And it's basically the primate brain factorizes what things are and where they are really, really explicitly. And so the argument is in the transformer that is the explicit representation of item and position that in the same way gives it the ability to do that amazing composition. So if you ask DALL-E for, a blue tomato, kind of on top of a pink banana, then, it will generate an image that has that property, right? And, as far as we understand, like non-transformer based architectures can't do that. And I believe that it's because the explicit representation of contents and position allows the network to kind of factorize what and where in the same way as the primate brain factorizes that information in the dorsal and ventral stream.
We're leaving out when in that account, right? So, I'm thinking you were mentioning it when you take action. I thought you were also going to start talking about the timing of those actions. But in a sense, time and space could be considered analogous, right? So like reading, the transformer doesn't read the way that we read, but there is a timing. And so we have that order also.
Yeah, sorry, I sort of garbled my examples, right? So, the transformer is easiest to illustrate by thinking about a sentence. But like, the examples of composition are like most vivid when thinking about like image generation, right? And in image generation, position is space. In a sentence, position is time. In the primate brain, or at least in the human brain, it seems more like when you really need to do like time over longer periods, like actual, kind of clearly we represent the dynamics of action, or we know that neural signals in the parietal cortex, in the dorsal stream, build up in concert with the dynamics of action. We know that parietal cortex is really important for really short, like visual short-term memory or iconic memory, like short representation, kind of in between two saccades, for example. But the sort of representation of time in a sentence in the primate or in the human brain requires the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is why, of course,
Right.
kind of you have disordered action sequences and disordered language if you have lesions of the various parts of the prefrontal cortex. So I think that the time, it's a similar story, but in humans, you additionally need the prefrontal. But yeah, same principle.
Not to, sometimes the way that I frame questions, I'm sort of, it's like I'm advocating some sort of AI versus neuro claim to foundational ideas, right? Because what I was going to ask you is, in, let's say, 10 years, if you were going to rewrite artificial natural intelligence, would you be able to include a story about how transformers map onto and or were inspired by neuroscience? And I ask because
I don't think
they
they
have
were
not
inspired,
been, right?
I don't think they were inspired by neuroscience. So I give you lots of examples of, kind of where ideas kind of co-emerged. So you might say that maybe there's a co-emergence of these ideas in neuroscience and AI research, but kind of the transformer. I do not think the authors of the transformer paper, kind of read a neuroscience textbook and then were like, "Hey, this is a great idea." It's definitely not how it happened. Although
I think it's the
kind
opposite.
of, no, sure, but maybe you could say the ideas are there in the ecosystem. But yeah, I mean, I think we will know more in 10 years' time. Hopefully, before then, we will know more about that process of factorization and composition. It's already a sort of pretty significant research topic in computational neuroscience. And, I'm fairly sure that, we're going to learn more about that. And that's going to be really fruitful. And maybe the transformer is going to be, yet another tool from AI research that, gets co-opted and used to understand the brain. It wouldn't surprise me in the least.
All right. So I've taken us to the limit here. I really appreciate your time. I have one more question for you. And earlier you mentioned that you didn't want to call the book Natural General Intelligence. And yet the book is called Natural General Intelligence. So why is it called that? And did you have an alternative?
No, I just have a limited imagination. And eventually I gave up looking for other titles.
Okay. Great answer. All right. Well, I really appreciate the book and our conversation today. Thanks for coming on again. And I guess I'll see you in a year's time or so, perhaps.
Well, I have to write another book then. But
yeah, get on
Paul,
it. Get on it.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
I alone produce Brain Inspired. If you value this podcast, consider supporting it through Patreon to access full versions of all the episodes and to join our Discord community. Or if you want to learn more about the intersection of neuroscience and AI, consider signing up for my online course, Neuro AI, The Quest to Explain Intelligence. Go to braininspired.co to learn more. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. You're hearing music by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.